Imagine a line drawn in the sand, a line that splits places, tears apart families, and changes the course of history. This is the very real story of partition, the moment when British India was divided into two independent countries, India and Pakistan. Today, we're exploring one of the most important and heart-wrenching events of the 20th century, the partition. In this video, we'll learn about the cultural, religious, and political tensions that led to the division of British India in 1947. From the mass migrations and violence that followed to the personal stories of loss and resilience, we're going to learn all about this complex historical event. Stick with us to find out how the issues of partition continue to affect the geopolitics of the region, affecting millions of lives, even today. Join us as we explore the untold stories, the unhealed wounds, and the unbreakable spirit of the people who were affected by the partition. This story begins with the British East India Company. It became a part of direct British Crown rule after the Indian Rebellion of 1857. Under the British government, India was a mix of diverse religions, cultures, and languages, coexisting under the umbrella of imperial control. However, things were not exactly peaceful. Enter the two-nation theory, an idea that gained popularity in the early 20th century. Encouraged by Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the All-Indian Muslim League, Jinnah argued that Muslims and Hindus were different nations, each deserving their own state. This idea was a response to fears among Muslims that they would be marginalized in a mostly Hindu India after independence. The Lahore Resolution of 1940 was a turning point in the division, which led to some people formally calling for a separate Muslim state to be created. This began a conflict that would only escalate in the coming years, especially as World War II left the British Empire weakened and more supportive of decolonization. Post-war, the British government tried to find a peaceful solution with the Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946. They proposed creating a united India, with significant freedoms for Muslim-majority provinces. However, neither the Congress nor the Muslim League could agree on the terms, leading to increased tensions and violence. Direct Action Day in Calcutta was a key example of this. On August 16, 1946, the All India Muslim League called for a day of protest to demand the creation of a separate Muslim state, Pakistan. What was meant to be a peaceful demonstration quickly spiraled into catastrophic violence that engulfed the city into chaos. Regular streets became arenas of unspeakable violence as mobs armed with makeshift weapons turned on each other. They were fueled by a mix of fear, hatred, and desperation. The violence spread like wildfire, consuming everyone in its path. Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, who had lived as neighbors, now found themselves caught in a vicious battle. It led to thousands dead, many more injured, and a city left in ruins, both physically and spiritually. As the situation became worse, Lord Louis Mountbatten came up with his own ideas. He was the last Viceroy of India, and he suggested a quick plan for partition. This plan led to the creation of two independent countries, India and Pakistan. It was soon accepted, although it was under pressure. British lawyer Sir Cyril Radcliffe drew the Radcliffe line. He had no knowledge of Indian conditions, and his line divided Punjab and Bengal. It led to huge migrations and unspeakable violence. At the stroke of midnight on August 15, 1947, the world saw India and Pakistan become sovereign nations. It was meant to be a moment that fulfilled dreams of independence. However, it was also the beginning of a challenging journey towards nation building during partition-induced chaos. The immediate aftermath of partition was catastrophic. Communities that had lived together for centuries were now torn apart. The migration of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs led to violence, with estimates of up to 2 million people losing their lives and many more displaced. The division created strong hostilities and conflicts, some of which continue to this day in regions like Kashmir. Creating separate nations based on religious identities had serious consequences. On one hand, it created places where communities could celebrate and practice their faith with a sense of belonging and freedom. However, it also made things worse for religious minorities. Individuals and families who had been forced from their ancestral lands had to rebuild their lives from the ashes of displacement. Their stories of adaptability and perseverance show just how humans can overcome challenges and create new beginnings against the odds. The horrors and heartaches of partition showed how people from different faiths needed to work together for reconciliation. The following decades saw people trying to bridge communal divides, trying to create a sense of mutual respect and understanding. Partition was more than a restructuring of geographical boundaries. It left permanent scars on the psyche of the subcontinent. Families were divided, cultural and economic ties were severed, and a legacy of mutual suspicion and hostility was born. The wounds of partition remain unhealed. It's a chapter of pain and loss, yet it's important to acknowledge and remember, for in the depths of human suffering, there are compelling stories of resilience, courage, and the undefeated spirit to rebuild. Following partition, Punjab and Bihar became the centers of horrific massacres. In Amritsar, Punjab, the air was thick with the smell of death, as thousands of innocent lives were snuffed out in a gruesome display of brutality aimed at religious minorities. Similarly, the Bihar massacres painted the streets red, leaving behind a trail of sorrow and despair. Sadly, these massacres were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern of targeted violence that tried to cleanse entire regions of their religious other. The trains, once seen as symbols of progress and connection, turned into carriers of death. They were packed with refugees, desperate to escape the violence. However, these trains were ambushed, and their passengers were mercilessly slaughtered. The Godhra train massacre was a particularly horrible example, where the hopes of countless families were extinguished in flames of communal fury. However, things became even worse. The violence became more personal, with targeted killings. Individuals were hunted down, their identities sealed by their faith. This climate of fear and paranoia seeped into communities, tearing them apart. The partition also created one of the largest mass migrations in human history. Over 14 million people found themselves on the move, trapped between the new nations of India and Pakistan. Families were ripped apart, with many losing loved ones to the chaos of migration. It was a dangerous journey, with numerous souls dying along the way, their dreams of safety going with them. The Radcliffe line also divided territories and hearts. Villages were split down the middle, and families found themselves on opposite sides of a border that had sprung up overnight. The emotional toll was huge, as people struggled with the loss of their communities, homes, and very identities. For many, the partition meant the end of life as they knew it. Uprooted from their lands, they lost their homes, their livelihoods, their cultural heritage, and their place in the world. The struggle to rebuild from nothing in a land that was no longer theirs was a huge challenge. At the same time, they faced discrimination, hostility, and limited opportunities for rehabilitation. The dream of a peaceful life remained just that, a dream. Rebuilding their lives was something almost impossible, filled with relentless challenges and the constant shadow of their past. The trauma of violence, the grief of loss, and the burden of starting over in a foreign land was shared by millions. It was something that passed down through generations. The psychological and emotional scars carried by refugees were perhaps the most enduring legacy of the partition. Partition also led to a huge refugee crisis on a scale that had never been seen before. Refugee camps, overwhelmed by the sheer number of displaced individuals, were ill-equipped to handle the crisis. Overcrowding, inadequate access to food, water, and sanitation, and the outbreak of diseases made the misery of those who had already lost everything even worse. The partition was a turning point that reshaped millions of lives and the very soul of South Asia. The stories of violence, displacement, and the struggle for survival during and after the partition are things that are still felt today. The partition showed the darkest parts of humanity. Massacres, targeted killings, and train killings that showed a horrific picture of intolerance and hatred. Yet, during this darkness, there were also countless stories of courage, compassion, and resilience. Ordinary people from all walks of life, often risking their own lives, stepped forward to protect their neighbors, friends, and even strangers. These acts of humanity during widespread chaos show how there is always the potential for kindness, even in the most trying times. Partition has influenced the politics, society, and cultures of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. It has influenced the identities of nations and individuals alike, creating memories of loss and displacement, but also of survival and rebuilding. Even in the face of horrible tragedy, there is hope for a future built on the foundations of understanding, peace, and shared humanity.